Hey everyone, this is Erin and Cam from Samuel's Public Library. Welcome to Helltown Campfire Stories, where we'll be reading and discussing scary tales written by local community members and partially based on Virginia folklore and local history. So without further ado, let's delve into the episode story, Eyes in the Water by J.P. Gibson. It was the first day of a new job for Jason. After recently moving to a small town in Virginia from Maine, he had heard of a recent job opening at the local factory packing military parachutes for the war effort over in Europe. The United States had just invaded Normandy, and business was booming. Jason figured a change would be beneficial after his recent divorce. This new town seemed welcoming, and the noisy nearby river was calming to his already very stressful mind, even if it had a weird smell to it. Ever since his job interview, he knew this was the next step he needed in his life. Jason's previous job was at a factory creating steel beams for skyscrapers, and even during peacetime, the construction never stopped. Jason often wondered how different things would look to homecoming vets of this seemingly never-ending war as he packed the parachutes. This new job seems a much better fit for him, and he enjoyed the scenery of the woods around his house. He had practically no neighbors around, and the local inn, which also functioned as the local watering hole, wasn't too far. He and his coworkers would often meet up almost every night to talk about the ongoing war against Hitler and their fear for the future. After coming home from the inn, he would often sit on his front porch, watching the fireflies create constellations in his yard. One night, as he sat on his porch, he saw someone coming up the gravel path that ran along his property. It was his coworker, Jim. He seemed anxious as he briskly walked the path, continuously looking over his shoulder. Concerned, Jason got up from his seat and called out, "Hey Jim, something the matter? Having a good night?" Jim stopped in his tracks and gave him a look of confusion and a bit of embarrassment. After a few moments, he reluctantly walked over. "Hey, Jason, I have a strange question, but don't judge what I'm about to ask. I just saw something that didn't make much sense even to myself." Jason motioned for him to come and sit in the other chair. "Did you know some people have disappeared in the area? We thought they up and enlisted until a man had washed up along the river. The police could barely tell it was a body, never mind it was a man. The coroner said it was a bear attack, but I've never seen one so vicious." Jim started to look lost, and Jason was about to ask what he had seen until Jim snapped out of it. "I took a different path up the river past the factory today. There I was, minding my own business, when I got this weird feeling like something was staring at me, all angry and I was a lump of meat." Jason tried to joke. "Come on, Jim, what'd you see? Bear, mountain lion? Have you been drinking?" Jim looked at him confused and then stared out into the night. "I know that thing wasn't a bear. You're not from here. I know you wouldn't really believe me." Jason looked a bit incredulous. "This thing was big. It was dark, but I know it was big. Its face was so distorted coming out of the river, piercing yellow eyes, and its skin." He paused for a second, took a shuddering breath, and then continued. "Or what you could call skin. It had these patches of peeling scales in its teeth, sharp with bits of flesh coming off, and I don't know what it was, but that was no bear." He grabbed hold of Jason's shirt. "And I heard rumors that the factory was putting things in the river, leftover chemicals." All right, Jim, I think you've had a little too much to drink. How about you come inside and sleep this off?" Jim was swaying a bit as Jason led him inside over to the couch and got him a glass of water. Jason laid awake for hours or so thinking about what Jim had said, how scared and confused he looked. Jason wasn't sure if he should believe him. The story seemed a bit much, but Jim seemed to believe what he was saying. Jason drifted off to sleep, his dreams plagued with images of sharp teeth and slimy scales. The next morning, Jason walked into the living room to find that Jim had already left. Jason shrugged it off and started to get ready for work. He remembered what Jim had said that night before, and while he didn't really believe the crazy booze-induced story, it still left him a little on edge, even if it was a bit childish. He made a mental note to walk near the river on his way home. Maybe he would find some tracks or traces of local wildlife to ease Jim's nerves. After work, Jason had decided to go straight home instead of meeting coworkers at the inn. As he left the factory, the sun was starting to set behind the mountains, and he started along the river path. After several minutes of calm, he started to get a weird feeling, like eyes boring into the back of his head. He remembered Jim's story. Jason looked over his shoulder. He saw calm river waters, the slight swaying of the yellow trees. Everything was fine. After a moment, he chastised himself for being irrational and continued on his way, till he heard a sound. A low, guttural sound. It was quick, quiet, but enough to stop him in his tracks. At the corner of his eyes, he saw rippling movement along the river, splashes and bubbles on the surface. He remembered what Jim had described. He didn't want to look out on the river. Hearing that same guttural sound, louder this time, he jerked his head to the right and saw something poking out of the water, half visible, was this thing with piercing yellow eyes, sharp teeth clenched down on rotten fish, stale blood pouring out of its mouth. And it was staring right at him. Terrified, Jason was frozen in place, sweat forming on the back of his neck. He was unable to break its gaze. All of a sudden, it started to move. Water breaking behind it, his half-submerged head got closer and closer. Jason bolts, trying to get as much distance between him and that thing within the river. As he finally made it home, he slammed and locked the door. For the rest of the night, he sat on the couch, a rifle within reach, listening for that guttural sound and movements from outside. The fireflies making strange fluttering lights from the shutters. It no longer seemed comforting. He didn't want to see the constellations anymore. He couldn't seem to process whatever it was he had seen. Surely his eyes were deceiving him. Nothing like that could truly exist, right? Then morning came. He was exhausted. Yet it was only Wednesday, and he had another 3 days of work until the weekend. He considered not going in, but money was tight after he spent a good portion of his savings on the move. So he got ready and walked to work, ensuring the river was far enough away. Upon reaching the factory, he was met by the sight of a crowd, police blocking the entrance, and unloaded a stretcher from a truck. Someone must have gotten hurt. Freak accidents are not uncommon with heavy machinery when it's involved, and Jim had mentioned a couple previous incidents over drinks at the inn. However, even knowing there could be a perfectly rational explanation for the police cars out front, Jason still felt a chill down his spine as he remembered that piercing yellow eyes from the night before and Jim's shaken demeanor. He walked closer. Coworkers were milling about, trying to see past the police barriers as a stretcher, now carrying a body, was rolled closer. It was Jim. He could tell from the clothes. He had been wearing the same sweater yesterday, and now it was wet from the river, torn and seeping with what suspiciously looked like blood. Jason had never seen a dead body before. One of Jim's hands dangled over the side of the stretcher, lifeless, and he barely heard one of the officers sending the crowd home. There was no work today. Jason walked in a stupor, wasn't paying attention to where he was going until he heard the sound of the river close by. His heart rate started to climb, and his thoughts started to register the possible danger. Had Jim been walking this way? Was what he saw last night a real threat and not just something his overly tired mind conjured up after a friend's story? He stopped to listen for the growl he had heard earlier. If it was there, he knew it would be close, waiting for an opportunity to strike its next victim. He thought back to what Jim had told him just a couple nights before, the factory dumping chemicals and that smell emanating from the river. Was the factory to blame for this thing? The chemicals? What was it before? And then he heard a sound. He was right. It was close. It was dead quiet by the river. The air was still, no rippling in the water, no birds or the sounds of insects, just a dripping, drip, drip, drip of water hitting dead leaves in the dense woods off to the left. It was hunting, and he knew it was hunting him. If it was an animal, he could probably smell him. Not really thinking about where he was running, Jason bolted down the path back towards the factory where there was police and guns. But he could hear it behind him, wet feet slapping the dirt path as it got alarmingly closer. And Jason didn't see the dead branch until it was too late. He hit the ground hard, his vision going white as he clawed at the dirt in a desperate attempt to get his bearings, but it was already on him. Pain, hot burning pain ran up his leg as sharp serrated teeth ripped into his calf, gnawing and jerking him from side to side, and then back towards the river as he screamed. Closer and closer to the river he was dragged, arms flailing, trying to grab hold of anything, but only able to pull up grass and weeds. Finally, he felt the water, and then there was nothing, just a burning cold filling his lungs. Back at the factory, one of the officers looked startled. He swore he could have heard a scream coming down that dirt path. Looking over towards his partner, he said, "Hey, Ralph, I think we have another one." His partner looked up in annoyance. What? He had been trying to get Jim's body into the back of the coroner's van. The police officer motioned towards the path. "Seriously?" Ralph exclaimed. "We just got done cleaning up this mess." Sighing, he wiped his brow with the back of his hand and looked back at the factory doors. They really need to stop feeding that thing. Okay, everybody, that was Eyes in the Water by J.P. Gibson. And just as a little disclaimer that it is a fictional story, but it's based on Virginia folklore and some local history. So, Cam, what was the main inspiration for this?
Well, the main inspiration wasn't the fishman from the Black Lagoon. I'm going to have to say the main inspiration, from what I've heard, was the Avtex plant that we had here in Front Royal. It was actually pretty interesting hearing about it. It was actually synthetics fiber plant that was used mainly to produce fibers for parachutes or insulating things for NASA. So that was actually pretty interesting.
So where in town was the Avtac factory located? Like just a general location?
It's back around the Skyline Soccerplex near Kerfoot originally is where the plant would have been.
Okay, so I wasn't around during the time that Avtex was still in operation, which I believe was back in the 90s. Was there during
I'm gonna have to say late 80s.
late 80s? Okay, I do remember some people who were around here during that time. They said like the town used to smell really bad.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Surprisingly, you wouldn't believe that today with how wonderful it is in the Shenandoah Valley, the fresh air and all the hikers that attend here. We definitely did have some pretty bad air, and it was actually much worse closer to the Avtex plant.
Okay, so what were they making in the plant exactly?
They were making synthetic silk and fibers, which is actually the process itself, I don't know, but the byproduct contained a lot of poisonous chemicals that tainted the land and the air.
So they actually were lab dumping chemicals into the river.
Not intentionally. I know they had a setup for where they had vats where it would be disposed, but everything doesn't always go as according to plan. A few of them may have gotten a leak and started to get into the soil and start to mess with the water table.
So what happened what was going on during the time when they were starting to close down? Because I know this was like actually a big news story.
There were a lot of things going on, from work-related injuries to ecological damage, that it was hard for them to stay open, where they've had inspections and people wanting them to be held to a higher standard. It was a high investigation that people wanted to see through. And there was a point where they were working on a way to be saved, but of course it didn't fall through. They needed more funds to keep themselves open, and they almost did get it from NASA. They almost did get a pretty big order that would have kept them open, but after a meeting, everything was discussed to close down the plan.
So was there any other problems that kind of arose from unfortunate pollution into the river? Was there any health issues around Front Royal? And
I'm gonna have to say, for the issues that were caused, bad air, of course, did mess with everyone. I'm not gonna say it messed with them and caused them to gain a third eye or an extra limb, but
yeah, I think that would be pretty noticeable around here.
yeah, but the closer you were, there were more effects, and this was actually pretty interesting. If you looked at some of the Avtex documents in the library, they show what effects can be seen and what can possibly happen to certain people in age groups and anything else. But the people that were closest across the riverbank from Avtex, they actually had to start drinking water from a different source and using it for different things like washing their clothes and showering, because of all the chemicals that were found inside the water table near the plant.
Okay, yeah, I kind of remember there was a news story I remember, it was years ago, but it was a city out west where they got in the news for using a local polluted river as the local water source, and it caused a huge problem. And of course, I don't know about the health issues, but it wouldn't surprise me if chemicals in the water that's going to cause some problems. So I'm assuming cancer was a big worry for the most part.
It was a big concern, and I'm going to say, from my standpoint, it was going to be a high speculation.
So I'm assuming I would assume people who lived pretty close to that factory were going to be a little bit worried, especially if they're having to import a lot of their water.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they were worried, because who wants to be notified like the next day after you've been living there for, let's say, maybe a few years, weeks, or months, and then you're just notified the next day, oh, I can't use the groundwater anymore, which of course anyone who lives in the mountains or has well water is just like,
what are we gonna do?
Yeah. So that's pretty scary. It was definitely a main concern. And from some of the reading I've done, it looked like it was kind of bad in that area across from Avtex. A lot of the homes that were made near on the property were affected quite bad. Like, some people did attribute some of the deaths, or if not all, to the Avtex plant. Anyone who did survive, I don't know, but it's tragic either way.
But I mean, people don't have to worry about anything right now. I mean, the town's water is fine, right?
Oh yes, like, of course, we've come a far way since then. That place was shut down in like the late 80s. So everything's been much better now. Of course, I'm not going to say, yeah, this is like having a nuclear meltdown and we can't live here or drink or eat anything near from the river. We still do have traces, and I mean traces like very microscopic traces where if you probably drank a bit of water, if you went swimming or rafting or just got like a speck, it's not gonna hurt you.
You'll be fine.
Yeah, you'll be fine. Like the way it's been seen and tested by some people that have gone to that Shenandoah River near where Avtex used to be, as long as there is anything such as crustaceans, oysters, clams, any little shells in the river, if there are tadpoles, any wildlife that is like flourishing there, it is perfectly fine, because whenever that life does start to come back there, that means the water is safe for life.
So definitely no three-eyed fish or a very scary swamp monster, huh?
Well, I can't attest that the chemicals didn't cause a three-eyed fish. I'm going to say it's not likely, but of course, even if there isn't any human interaction or cause and effect with what we do, nothing's saying that nature can't come up with its own monster.
Yeah, I was gonna say that was a joke. So no one's actually ever seen, I mean, okay, so this story is a swamp, like, this makes me think of like, oh, what's the old one? The swamp monster, or no,
Creature from the Black Lagoon?
creature, yeah, there's the creature from the Black Lagoon, and then there's, I think, swamp monster, but.
Probably.
Yeah. But so because we said, this is going to be based off of, Virginia folklore and local history. And while, we went over Avtech, but I'm not saying that, we don't actually have a local swamp monster in the area that this was based off of.
As far as I know, we don't have a swamp that can create one.
I will say it would still be kind of cool.
Definitely would be.
So the actual monster in the story, and for some reason my brain immediately thinks Shape of Water, but that is not necessarily a horror movie. But just like and it wasn't really described in here besides like basically the face, but in my head I kept thinking like bipedal, like, webbed feet and hands and, needle teeth and scary and stuff like that. So do you know any other stuff in, media that's similar as far as story-wise?
I'm gonna have to say no. I'm thinking back to more classic movie culture back in the 50s, 60s, when they came out with things of the unknown. Pretty much we were in broad territory where we were thinking of things that would scare us, scare the populace. And we still can go back to things that were pretty corny and cheesy, and it's still, from their standards, it looked awful, but with our updated CGI and imaginations, things have grown much more terrifying.
See, I actually have to admit, when it comes to the older stuff, I've been going back and rewatching some 80s movies when they didn't really, CGI wasn't really a thing. And I have to say, like, using some pretty good of the special effects makeup, some of those are even scarier than just using the CGI.
Definitely scary. It's pretty scary when it's a cheap CGI, though.
I think I have to agree. So for anybody who's interested in learning more about Avtex, the Samuels Public Library is actually the repository for all the old Avtech documents, and not many people know we actually have them here. We don't really have them in the catalog yet, it's something we're thinking about doing. So if anybody's interested, feel free to stop by the library and, come up to the reference desk, and we're more than willing to show you guys some cool things about Avtex.
But for any other information that isn't available by the library, there are tons of articles online that you can find dating back to the 1980s, whenever there were events such as injuries or what was going on with the story at the time. Everyone has their own story. Sometimes it gets lost in time, but as of right now, if you're interested, go look it up and see what you can find.
So that's it for this episode. This is Aaron and Cam with Samuels Public Library's Helltown Campfire Stories. Till next time.